course. That was the Middle East, and there was no question about who was going to run that. Back in the mid-40s, it was described, State Department, as a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. When Eisenhower came along, he called it the most strategically important area in the world. One of the top planners, a burly New Dealer, pointed out that control over Middle East oil would provide the United States with substantial control of the world. So that's no small prize. And hanging on to the Middle East is critically important. That's basically the background of the wars going on in Iraq and AfPak. Even Afghanistan, it has some resources, but it's in a strategic position at the edge of the Middle East oil resources and also now the Central Asian ones. So one critical element in the background of planning in Afghanistan is whether the U.S. can finally implement a plan that's been around for years, through the Clinton years, to set up a pipeline that would go from Turkmenistan, which has a ton of natural gas, to India, which means we'd have to go through Afghanistan and through Kandahar province, where the Canadian troops are, to Pakistan, through Pakistan and to India. And the point of that is dual. One is to keep Russia from getting it. Most of it goes to Russia now, and there's kind of a battle over, pipeline battle over who controls Central Asian resources. They're not comparable to the Gulf, but they're substantial. And the other reason is just to try to intensify the U.S. effort to isolate Iran. The natural source for India for fossil fuel, petroleum, and so on, is Iran. And there are plans for an Iranian-Pakistani pipeline, and the U.S. wants to block that. And the idea is if you can provide a Turkmenistan through Afghanistan, Pakistan pipeline, that'll keep the Indians away from making deals with Iran. India is playing a complicated game on this. They're not quite going along, but partially so. The U.S.-India nuclear arrangements last year, which essentially exempted India from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, allows the United States to contribute to their nuclear programs, which of course means indirectly their nuclear weapons program. It's also partly seen against that background, part of the effort to prevent Iranian entry into the world. And this is a pretty serious business. There now is, as you may know, a China-based regional alliance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes China, of course, Russia, all the Central Asian states, Mongolia, and it has as observers Pakistan, India, and Iran. The United States asked for observer status and was turned down, so it doesn't have observer status. And they've already passed resolutions calling for ending of all U.S. bases in Central Asia. There's a lot of jockeying about that. And they're also making moves, especially China, towards the Middle East, the real investments in Saudi Arabia and so on. And that's really threatening because that's, remember, the most strategically important part of the world, mainly Saudi Arabia. And if you control that, you can control the world. So there's a lot at stake. What's in the background of Afghanistan and Iraq is not slight. I mean, Iraq itself has probably the second largest oil reserves in the world. Well, you'll hear more about that later. Let's turn quickly to Latin America. In Latin America, the internal documents, which have since been released, make this planning extremely clear. It's back around 1950. They identify the primary threat to U.S. interests in Latin America as radical and nationalistic regimes that appeal to the masses of the population and seek to satisfy the popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. I mean, if this kind of stuff sounds like it's coming out of a Maoist pamphlet, it's not surprising. The business classes are dedicated Marxists vulgar Marxists, just the values are inverted. And they are always talking about the masses and this and that and what we have to do to control them. So the rhetoric is kind of like Maoist pamphlets, just different values, and not so different sometimes. Well, the radical and nationalist regimes that appeal to the masses of the population, they want development for domestic needs. Those tendencies conflict. I'm still reading National Security Council, conflict with demand for a political and economic climate conducive to private investment, which means, of course, U.S. investment, and with adequate repatriation of profits and protection of our raw materials. That's George Kennan again. They're our raw materials by accident. They happen to be somewhere else, but we've got to protect them. And Kennan, in fact, is considered a kind of at the humanist fringe of planning, was very much in favor of supporting police states and violent repression to ensure the protection of our resources and our interests in Latin America. This conception is not just applied to Latin America. The United States is a global power, so you find the same thinking all over the world. For example, when the U.S., to take a currently crucial case, Iran, when the U.S. and Britain overthrew the parliamentary government of Iran in 1953 and installed a brutal tyrant who reigned until 1979, the New York Times, expressing the doctrinal wing of the power system, their editors published an editorial praising, they knew what was happening, no secret about it, praising the overthrow of the parliamentary government and saying that it will provide an object lesson to underdeveloped countries with rich resources that go berserk with fanatical nationalism. Now they'll see what happens to them if they try to take our resources. They were thinking of trying to nationalize our resources there. So this was a good thing, and installing the Shah was fine. They said it's going to be more troubles like this elsewhere, but maybe sensible leaders will understand the penalty they pay if they try to interfere with grand area planning, our military and economic supremacy and access to the resources and raw materials and markets which are ours by right. That's why you never get any criticism of anything in the doctrinal system. There are criticisms of U.S. power because it's costing too much. So like, say, Obama, he's considered a principled critic of the Iraq War. His criticism, if you look back, was that it was a strategic blunder. It's costing too much, not going to work, and so on. In fact, what he said was pretty much what you could read in Pravda in 1985 when the Russians had invaded Afghanistan. In the press, there were condemnations of it as strategic blunder. It's going to cost too much. We're not going to get enough. It's not worth it. In fact, if we had records, I'm sure you could have heard it in discussions of the German General Staff after Stalingrad, when they recognized that a two-front war was a strategic blunder. Should have knocked out England and then gone after Russia. So there is criticism of strategic blunders and errors and failures of that kind, but that's about the limit. And anywhere in the doctrinal system, maybe way out at the fringes, something else, but it's very constant. Vietnam War is a perfect example, no time. Well, continuing with another aspect of planning back in the 1940s with regard to Latin America is that we must make sure that they avoid what was called excessive industrialization. Excessive means competing with the U.S. So if they want to develop a steel industry, say in Brazil, that's okay, but should be the kind of steel that we don't want to bother producing, low-cost, low-tech steel, but not competing with us. So we got to block excessive industrialization policies that are directed to improving the low living standards of the masses and so on. And a good bit of the history of the U.S. and Latin America, right up till today, is just the playing out of this thinking. It's pretty familiar.